The air was heavy with rain that night, the kind of rain that makes the streets shine like broken glass under the lamps. I had always stayed late at school for extra practice, but something about that evening felt different. He had noticed me again, the way his eyes lingered when the classroom emptied and it was just me packing my books in silence. His voice was calm when he asked if I had time to stop by his studio, the way someone might casually invite you for tea, yet I could feel something stir in my chest. I had never been to his private space before, only imagined what kind of world existed beyond the walls of the classroom where he ruled with quiet authority. My heart was racing even before I nodded, not knowing why I said yes so quickly, not knowing why it felt dangerous but exciting. The studio was tucked away in an older part of town, far from the neat streets I knew. He opened the door and let me step inside first, and the warmth of the room wrapped around me like an embrace. Paintings leaned against every wall, unfinished canvases stood waiting, brushes soaked in water that smelled faintly of turpentine. The space was alive, messy, human, so different from the polished image he carried in school. I felt like I had been given access to a part of him no one else knew, and that thought alone made my pulse quicken. He poured us both a glass of water, his hand brushing mine briefly as he set it down, and that fleeting contact burned hotter than anything I had ever felt. That we sat across from each other, and though he spoke at first about his work, the colors, the struggle of creating something real, I found myself drifting. His voice was steady, deep, but there was something softer when he looked at me, like the words weren't just about art but about us. Every time his gaze held mine, it was as if the room shrank until there was nothing but the two of us. My shirt clung to me slightly from the damp walk, and I became acutely aware of myself in a way I never had before. He must have noticed, because he leaned closer, his hand reaching out not with hesitation but with certainty, lifting me gently by the waist onto the desk that stood at the center of his studio. My breath caught as the world shifted beneath me, and for a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my heart against the storm outside that he didn't rush. That was what unsettled me most. His fingers moved slowly, unbuttoning the edges of my shirt as if he were unfolding a story he had been waiting to read. My skin shivered under his touch, not because of the cold, but because every movement was filled with meaning. I could feel his breath close, warm against my neck, and the intimacy of it pulled me deeper into a place I didn't know I had been longing for. My hands trembled, unsure of where to rest, but he steadied me with a look that said I was safe here, even in the chaos of what was happening. When the shirt slid off my shoulders, it wasn't just fabric falling away, it was the weight of fear, the barriers I had carried for so long. I had hidden parts of myself from the world, from friends, from family, even from my own reflection. But here, in that studio filled with colors and unfinished dreams, I felt seen. He traced lines across my chest like he was sketching something only he could envision, and in that touch I understood what it meant to be truly noticed. The silence between us was louder than any confession, and yet it spoke volumes. Desire, care, something raw and unspoken that I tried to speak, to name the storm of emotions inside me, but my voice failed. Instead, I let myself lean into the closeness, surrendering to the honesty of the moment. Every second felt stretched, suspended, as if time itself wanted us to remain there forever. The studio light flickered, shadows dancing along the walls, and I realized this was not just about attraction. It was about trust, about stepping into something terrifying and beautiful at once. He didn't ask for permission with words, but with every pause, every glance, Every gentle brush of his hand, he gave me the chance to say no. I didn't. I couldn't. As the rain kept falling outside, the world beyond those walls ceased to exist. There was only the desk beneath me, his presence before me, and the unspoken promise that nothing would ever feel the same again. My body was trembling, not out of fear, but out of the weight of finally letting go. I closed my eyes for a moment, and when I opened them, I saw him differently, not just as a teacher, but as someone who had unlocked a door inside me that I never knew I wanted opened. That night marked the beginning of something neither of us could have planned, something that would change both of us in ways we hadn't yet dared to imagine. The morning after that night felt unreal, as if I had stepped into a dream that clung to me long after I opened my eyes. I couldn't stop replaying everything that had happened in the studio, the way his hands had moved with such care, the way his voice had softened when he spoke, and the way the storm outside had seemed to echo the storm inside me. At school, the walls felt tighter, the corridors narrower, and yet the world was brighter somehow, as though colors I had never noticed were suddenly sharper. Every time I caught sight of him standing at the front of the room, explaining lessons like nothing had changed, my heart pounded against my chest, and I had to force myself to look away before anyone noticed. I kept wondering if it showed on my face, if my classmates could read the truth in my eyes, if they could see how one evening had rewritten everything I thought I knew about myself. He, on the other hand, carried himself with that same calm confidence, his voice steady, his gestures precise, but when his gaze brushed mine, even for a second, I felt the ground tilt beneath me. There was something unspoken in that look, something that told me he remembered just as vividly as I did, and it sent a heat through my chest that left me restless. I could barely keep still, my hands fidgeting with pens, books, anything to anchor myself when my thoughts threatened to spill over. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to live with a secret that both terrified me and thrilled me at the same time. When the last bell rang and the room emptied, I lingered longer than usual, pretending to pack slowly, waiting for the chance to hear his voice when it was just us again. The silence stretched between us, heavy but magnetic, until he finally spoke, his tone softer than during class. He asked if I was all right, if I had slept, if everything was fine, but I could hear the weight beneath his words. I wanted to tell him that nothing was fine, that everything had changed, that I couldn't stop thinking about him, but the words caught in my throat. All I managed was a quiet yes, a nervous smile, and yet it seemed to be enough because he smiled back, a smile that held something only meant for me. Over the next days, the distance between us became both unbearable and necessary. We couldn't risk being careless, couldn't let the truth slip through a glance held too long or a gesture too tender. And yet every stolen moment, every fleeting second of closeness, felt like a spark that lit something deeper. There were times when he would hand me back a paper, his fingers brushing mine with the lightest touch, and though no one else noticed, it sent a shiver through me. There were times when I stayed behind under the excuse of needing help, when his voice would lower, his body leaning slightly closer, and I could feel the warmth of him even without contact. These moments were small, almost invisible to the world, but to me they were everything. That night, I lay awake thinking about him, about the way his studio smelled of paint and wood and rain, about the way his presence filled every corner of the space. I thought about the way he had lifted me onto the desk as though I was both fragile and strong, the way he had looked at me not as a student but as someone worth seeing. Those memories lived in me like fire, both comforting and dangerous. I feared what it meant, feared what would happen if anyone found out, but at the same time I couldn't stop craving more. I wanted to be near him again, to feel that electricity that only he seemed capable of drawing out of me. One evening, when the hallways had grown quiet and the sky outside was turning deep with the promise of another storm, he asked me to walk with him. My heart leapt before I even answered, and though my voice trembled, I agreed. The air outside was cool, damp with the memory of rain, and we walked side by side without speaking for a while. Every step felt loaded, every glance stolen, until finally he stopped under the shadow of a tree where the streetlights couldn't quite reach. He looked at me in that way again, the way that stripped me bare without a word, and asked softly if I was sure about everything, if I truly wanted this path, because once we stepped deeper, there would be no going back. In that moment, I realized I had never been more certain of anything. My voice didn't shake this time when I said yes, and the relief in his eyes was so profound it nearly broke me. He reached for my hand, not bold, not reckless, but with a tenderness that made my chest ache. For the first time outside the studio, our hands fit together, hidden by the dark, and I knew we had crossed another invisible line. The world around us kept moving, cars passing, the hum of life carrying on, but in that little corner of shadows, it felt like time had paused just for us. I walked home that night with my heart full and heavy, knowing we had stepped further into something both beautiful and forbidden. The danger of it lingered at the edges of my thoughts, but stronger than fear was the pull I felt toward him, a pull I no longer wanted to resist. Every choice from here on would be complicated, but the thought of turning back felt impossible. Whatever lay ahead, I knew I was already in too deep to ever return to who I was before. The days that followed felt like living between two worlds. On the surface, everything looked the same, classrooms filled with voices, chalk scratching against the board, books stacked neatly on my desk. But underneath, there was a current running strong, invisible to everyone else yet impossible for me to ignore. Every time his voice carried across the room, I felt it sink into me deeper than any lesson could. Every time our eyes met, it was like a quiet reminder of the night in his studio, of the walk under the tree, of the moment when our hands had fit together in the dark. I began to live for those moments, for the silent connection only we could feel, and it left me both restless and alive in a way I had never experienced. The secret we carried grew heavier, not because it was unwanted, but because the weight of wanting more pressed harder each day. I started to notice the way he lingered at the end of lessons, the way he sometimes let his words trail off when he caught my gaze, as though he was struggling against the same pull that consumed me. We never spoke about it in words, not directly, but the silence between us was rich with meaning. A brush of his hand when passing me a paper, a glance that lingered 1 second too long, these small moments were our language, and I learned to read every nuance as if my life depended on it. One afternoon, the air was heavy with the kind of warmth that makes you drowsy, and most of the class was half asleep. But I couldn't focus on anything except the way he moved around the room, the measured calm of his presence. I wondered if anyone else could sense what I felt, if my own face betrayed the longing that burned through me. When the bell finally rang and the others rushed out, I stayed behind, pretending to gather my things slowly. He glanced at me once, then again, and I could tell he was waiting for the room to be empty. The moment the door shut behind the last student, the silence wrapped around us like it always did, charged, unspoken, undeniable. He asked me quietly if I could come by again, his voice low, his eyes holding mine as though the question carried more weight than the words suggested. My chest tightened, and though fear flickered at the edges of my thoughts, fear of being caught, of what it all meant, I didn't hesitate. I nodded. That night, I found myself walking through the same streets again, my heart racing, the anticipation nearly unbearable. The studio door opened to him, and as I stepped inside, I felt the world fall away just like before. The canvases, the paints, the unfinished art, they were all the same, but the way he looked at me was not. This time there was no hesitation, no testing the waters. He moved closer with purpose, his presence filling every corner of the room, and I felt my body respond before I even thought about it that he touched my arm first, gentle but certain, as if reminding me that I could step back if I wanted to. But I didn't. I leaned into that touch, craving more, and in that instant something shifted. He drew me closer, and I could feel the heat of him, the steadiness of his breath, the tension of everything we hadn't said pressing down between us. When his lips finally met mine, it was nothing like I had imagined. It wasn't rushed or forceful, but slow, deliberate, like he was teaching me a language I had never known existed. My entire body trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming rush of being wanted, of being seen in a way I had hidden from the world. The kiss deepened, and time seemed to dissolve. The storm of emotions inside me was too vast for words, too powerful to name. I clung to him, not out of desperation, but out of a need to anchor myself in the truth of that moment. Every second felt like a confession, like a declaration that could not be spoken aloud. When we finally pulled apart, breathless, I searched his face for answers, for reassurance, and what I saw nearly undid me. His eyes were soft, filled with a kind of vulnerability I had never expected, as though he, too, was caught in the same storm that we didn't speak much after that. Words felt unnecessary, too small for what had just passed between us. Instead, we sat together in the quiet, the closeness between us louder than any conversation could have been. He touched my hand, held it, and that simple act carried more meaning than anything else. It told me that this wasn't a mistake, that I wasn't alone in feeling what I felt. It told me that we were both stepping deeper into something dangerous, yes, but also something true. When I finally left the studio that night, the streets felt different beneath my feet. The air was cool, sharp with the scent of rain, and yet I felt lighter, as though the world had opened up to me in a way I had never imagined. I knew the risks, knew the complications, knew the shadows that lurked around every corner of what we were building. But as I walked home, my lips still tingling from his kiss, my heart certain and unshaken, I realized I didn't care. For the first time, I felt like I was truly living, like every step forward, no matter how uncertain, was worth it because it was leading me closer to him. The morning after our kiss, I woke with a strange ache in my chest, not painful but heavy with everything I had felt the night before. It lingered in me like a secret melody, one that refused to fade no matter how I tried to bury it under ordinary routines. I walked into school as if nothing had changed, yet everything inside me was different. The walls of the classroom felt narrower, the buzzing chatter of students sharper, and I carried the weight of knowing something no one else could ever guess. When he entered the room, my breath caught. He looked the same as always, calm, steady, his expression composed. But I knew better now. I knew the warmth of his touch, the softness of his lips, the storm behind his eyes when he let his guard slip. It was like seeing the world through two lenses, the teacher everyone else respected, and the man who had kissed me with a depth that shook me to my core. The lesson that day blurred before me, words spilling from the board that I couldn't hold on to. My mind drifted back to the studio, to the way the paintbrushes leaned like forgotten witnesses, to the way he had reached for me with hands that trembled ever so slightly even as they steadied me. I wondered if he was replaying it too, if his calm tone hid the same restless fire that kept me awake at night. At moments, our eyes met across the room, and though neither of us lingered long enough to draw attention, those brief glances were electric. My chest tightened each time, the reminder that we were walking a line so thin it could snap at any moment. Yet I couldn't bring myself to wish for distance. That afternoon, when the classroom finally emptied, I stayed behind once more, feigning the same excuse of slow packing. He moved around his desk, his movements careful, measured, as though each step carried the weight of unspoken words. The silence between us was charged again, and I felt my heart pounding as I closed my bag. He asked, softly, if I could walk with him later, his tone low enough that no one outside could have heard. My throat tightened, but I nodded quickly, unable to resist the pull. When the day dimmed into evening, we met quietly near the gates, not too close at first, keeping the space between us out of habit. But as we walked further into the quiet streets, the distance shrank naturally, our steps falling in rhythm. The city lights flickered like stars scattered at our feet, and the world seemed to blur around us. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words carried weight. He told me that what we were doing was dangerous, that people wouldn't understand, that the world was quick to judge and even quicker to condemn. But beneath his caution, I could hear the confession he wasn't making aloud, that he wanted this as much as I did, maybe even more. That I listened in silence, my chest tightening, and when he paused under the glow of a dim street lamp, I finally found my voice. I told him I didn't care, that for the first time in my life I felt alive, that the thought of losing this connection scared me more than the risk of anyone finding out. My voice shook, but I meant every word, and I saw something shift in his eyes, something fragile and raw. He reached out then, not bold, just steady, and took my hand in his. The simple act made my throat ache with emotion. We stood there, hand in hand, in a world that could never know, and it felt like the most honest moment of my life. Later, he led me back to his studio once again, and stepping inside felt different this time. The space no longer felt foreign, it felt familiar, almost like a second home. The smell of paint and turpentine wrapped around me, grounding me, but it was his presence that filled the air most of all. He sat across from me, studying me in silence as though memorizing every detail, and I felt bare under that gaze, exposed in a way that was both terrifying and beautiful. When he finally moved closer, brushing his hand against my cheek, I leaned into the touch without hesitation. The kiss that followed was deeper, more urgent than before, as though both of us were surrendering to something we could no longer resist. The night stretched endlessly, every second soaked in emotions I couldn't name. We talked in whispers, not about the world outside, but about the small pieces of ourselves we had never shared with anyone else. He told me about the doubts that haunted him, the loneliness of keeping his true self hidden, and I confessed my own fears, my own struggles of feeling out of place, unseen. In that room, we stripped ourselves down not just physically but emotionally, laying bare the truths we had always kept buried. It was messy, vulnerable, but it was real. And in the way he held me, in the way his voice softened when he said my name, I felt something I had never thought possible, the certainty of being loved. When I finally left, the night air felt alive against my skin, crisp and sharp, carrying the weight of everything we had shared. I walked slowly, afraid to let go of the feeling that still clung to me. My mind raced with the risks, the shadows that loomed over us, but my heart was louder than my fear. I knew this was only the beginning, that the path ahead would not be easy, that secrets and silence would become part of our lives. Yet I also knew that I couldn't step back now, not when every part of me was pulled toward him with a force I couldn't fight. Whatever came next, I was already his, and he was mine, bound together in ways the world would never see but that we could feel in every glance, every touch, every whispered word. The following week unfolded with a kind of tension that settled deep into my bones. On the surface, life went on as usual. The lessons, the chatter of students, the ringing of bells, it all looked the same to anyone who cared to glance. But for me, everything had shifted. Every hour felt heavy with anticipation, every day stretched long with the silent pull of wanting to be near him again. It was exhausting in a way, keeping the secret wrapped tightly inside me, but at the same time it was the only thing that kept me breathing. I caught myself staring at the clock too often, counting down minutes until I might catch his eye, hear his voice when the others had gone, feel again the warmth of his hand brushing against mine. It was maddening and addictive all at once that he carried himself with the same careful control, his face calm, his tone even, but I had learned to read him in ways no one else could. I saw the faint pause when his eyes found me, the shift in his voice when he addressed me directly, the way his shoulders seemed to hold a tension no one else noticed. He was living in the same two worlds as I was, balancing between the role everyone expected him to play and the truth he dared only show me. The contrast was sharp and thrilling. The man who stood tall in front of a class, untouchable, untamed, was the same man who held me with such tenderness in the quiet of his studio. And every day that passed, the need to see him again grew stronger, almost unbearable. One afternoon, the rain returned, steady and relentless, painting the windows with streaks of water that blurred the world outside. I stayed behind after class, my heart racing the way it always did when the room emptied and left just the two of us. He didn't speak at first, just watched me as I packed my things slowly, each movement deliberate, buying time. The silence thickened until finally he asked if I would come by again that evening. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, but his eyes gave him away. I nodded before I even thought about it. The rain seemed to follow me all the way to his studio, the streets shimmering with reflections, the air cool and sharp, and by the time I reached the door, my pulse was already unsteady. Inside, the studio was warmer than the storm outside, and yet there was a tension that neither of us could ignore. He stood close, too close, and the space between us collapsed with every passing second. When he finally stepped forward and pulled me into his arms, the embrace was fierce, almost desperate, as though he had been holding himself back for too long. His lips found mine quickly, and the kiss was different this time, not slow, not testing, but full of a hunger that matched the storm beating against the windows. My body responded without hesitation, every nerve alive, every thought swept away by the force of it, the desk, the canvases, the half-finished art surrounding us, it all became part of the moment, silent witnesses to something bigger than either of us had intended. He lifted me again, setting me on the desk like before, but this time there was no uncertainty in his hands. His touch was firm, sure, and yet still filled with care. My shirt slid off easily, and though I shivered under the cool air, the warmth of his touch consumed me. I closed my eyes, losing myself in the way his presence wrapped around me, in the way every part of him seemed to say without words that I was wanted, needed, cherished. It was overwhelming, frightening in its intensity, and yet I couldn't pull away even if I had wanted to. We stayed locked in that closeness for what felt like hours, the outside world fading until it didn't matter if time existed at all. Between whispered breaths and trembling touches, something deeper took root. It wasn't just desire, though that burned hot between us, it was connection. It was the raw truth of two souls finally daring to meet without masks, without fear, without the walls that had kept us hidden for so long. In his eyes, I saw not just longing but something softer, something that looked like love, though neither of us dared to name it out loud. Later, when the storm had eased and the air grew quiet again, we sat together in silence, our bodies close, his arm draped loosely around me. The weight of what we had done pressed on me, not with regret, but with the realization of how deep we had gone. There was no turning back anymore, no pretending it hadn't happened. I leaned against him, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and let myself imagine for a moment that the world outside didn't exist, that there was no danger, no risk, just us. But even in that moment of calm, I knew the truth. What we had was fragile, dangerous, and the world would not forgive us if it ever came to light. That knowledge lingered like a shadow, but it couldn't drown the warmth I felt pressed against him. When I finally left the studio, the streets were slick with fading rain, the air carrying that earthy scent of storms passing. I walked slowly, my body still buzzing with the memory of his touch, my mind restless with the weight of what we had become. I didn't know how long we could keep it hidden, how long we could balance between the worlds of silence and truth, but I knew one thing with certainty: I was no longer the same. He had changed me, marked me in ways that could never be erased, and though fear still haunted me, the thought of losing him haunted me even more. The following week unfolded with a kind of tension that settled deep into my bones. On the surface, life went on as usual. The lessons, the chatter of students, the ringing of bells, it all looked the same to anyone who cared to glance. But for me, everything had shifted. Every hour felt heavy with anticipation, every day stretched long with the silent pull of wanting to be near him again. It was exhausting in a way, keeping the secret wrapped tightly inside me, but at the same time it was the only thing that kept me breathing. I caught myself staring at the clock too often, counting down minutes until I might catch his eye, hear his voice when the others had gone, feel again the warmth of his hand brushing against mine. It was maddening and addictive all at once that he carried himself with the same careful control, his face calm, his tone even, but I had learned to read him in ways no one else could. I saw the faint pause when his eyes found me, the shift in his voice when he addressed me directly, the way his shoulders seemed to hold a tension no one else noticed. He was living in the same two worlds as I was, balancing between the role everyone expected him to play and the truth he dared only show me. The contrast was sharp and thrilling. The man who stood tall in front of a class, untouchable, untamed, was the same man who held me with such tenderness in the quiet of his studio. And every day that passed, the need to see him again grew stronger, almost unbearable. One afternoon, the rain returned, steady and relentless, painting the windows with streaks of water that blurred the world outside. I stayed behind after class, my heart racing the way it always did when the room emptied and left just the two of us. He didn't speak at first, just watched me as I packed my things slowly, each movement deliberate, buying time. The silence thickened until finally he asked if I would come by again that evening. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, but his eyes gave him away. I nodded before I even thought about it. The rain seemed to follow me all the way to his studio, the streets shimmering with reflections, the air cool and sharp, and by the time I reached the door, my pulse was already unsteady. Inside, the studio was warmer than the storm outside, and yet there was a tension that neither of us could ignore. He stood close, too close, and the space between us collapsed with every passing second. When he finally stepped forward and pulled me into his arms, the embrace was fierce, almost desperate, as though he had been holding himself back for too long. His lips found mine quickly, and the kiss was different this time, not slow, not testing, but full of a hunger that matched the storm beating against the windows. My body responded without hesitation, every nerve alive, every thought swept away by the force of it, the desk, the canvases, the half-finished art surrounding us, it all became part of the moment, silent witnesses to something bigger than either of us had intended. He lifted me again, setting me on the desk like before, but this time there was no uncertainty in his hands. His touch was firm, sure, and yet still filled with care. My shirt slid off easily, and though I shivered under the cool air, the warmth of his touch consumed me. I closed my eyes, losing myself in the way his presence wrapped around me, in the way every part of him seemed to say without words that I was wanted, needed, cherished. It was overwhelming, frightening in its intensity, and yet I couldn't pull away even if I had wanted to. We stayed locked in that closeness for what felt like hours, the outside world fading until it didn't matter if time existed at all. Between whispered breaths and trembling touches, something deeper took root. It wasn't just desire, though that burned hot between us, it was connection. It was the raw truth of two souls finally daring to meet without masks, without fear, without the walls that had kept us hidden for so long. In his eyes, I saw not just longing but something softer, something that looked like love, though neither of us dared to name it out loud. Later, when the storm had eased and the air grew quiet again, we sat together in silence, our bodies close, his arm draped loosely around me. The weight of what we had done pressed on me, not with regret, but with the realization of how deep we had gone. There was no turning back anymore, no pretending it hadn't happened. I leaned against him, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and let myself imagine for a moment that the world outside didn't exist, that there was no danger, no risk, just us. But even in that moment of calm, I knew the truth. What we had was fragile, dangerous, and the world would not forgive us if it ever came to light. That knowledge lingered like a shadow, but it couldn't drown the warmth I felt pressed against him. When I finally left the studio, the streets were slick with fading rain, the air carrying that earthy scent of storms passing. I walked slowly, my body still buzzing with the memory of his touch, my mind restless with the weight of what we had become. I didn't know how long we could keep it hidden, how long we could balance between the worlds of silence and truth, but I knew one thing with certainty: I was no longer the same. He had changed me, marked me in ways that could never be erased, and though fears still haunted me, the thought of losing him haunted me even more. The weeks had begun to blur together, every day carrying the weight of our secret and every night haunted by the memory of his touch. What once felt like fleeting stolen moments had now deepened into something heavier, something that tied itself to every breath I took. It was no longer just about the thrill of meeting him in the studio, no longer just about the electricity that sparked when his hand brushed mine or when his lips claimed me with quiet urgency. It had grown into something far more dangerous and far more unshakable. I found myself thinking about him constantly, not only in desire but in the smallest details of life, whether he had eaten, whether he was lonely when I wasn't there, whether he carried the same fear that shadowed me during the day. Love, I realized, wasn't just fire. It was also worry, care, and the constant ache of wanting to protect what mattered most. At school, I became more careful, forcing myself to laugh when others laughed, to study harder, to play the part of the student who had nothing unusual weighing on him. But the strain of pretending began to gnaw at me. I could feel it in the way my smiles faltered, in the way my eyes drifted toward him too often, in the way my heart stuttered when he entered the room. He kept his composure with admirable control, his face calm and his voice steady, but when I looked closely, I saw the same cracks forming in him. The small pauses. The heaviness in his shoulders. The way he seemed to search for me even when surrounded by dozens of other faces. It was both comforting and terrifying to know we were breaking under the same weight. One evening, as the classroom emptied and the light outside dimmed into the soft glow of twilight, he asked me to stay. His tone carried a quiet urgency that made my stomach twist. When the door clicked shut, the silence was heavier than usual, and I knew before he spoke that something was wrong. He paced the room for a moment, his hands tightening at his sides, before finally confessing that whispers had begun to stir. Someone had noticed how often I lingered, how my eyes followed him, how there seemed to be a thread tying us together. My chest constricted, the blood rushing loud in my ears, and I felt the ground tilt beneath me. The world we had built, fragile as glass, was beginning to crack. That he told me we needed to be careful, more careful than ever. His words were calm, but his eyes betrayed him, filled with a fear that mirrored my own. I wanted to reach for him, to hold him, to remind him that what we shared was real and worth the risk, but the walls of the classroom seemed to press in, suffocating us with the reminder of how much we stood to lose. I nodded, swallowing hard, my throat tight with emotions I couldn't put into words. The thought of losing him now felt unbearable, worse than any judgment, worse than any punishment the world could throw at us. Later that night, I went to his studio once more, the need to see him too strong to ignore. When I stepped inside, the atmosphere was different. The room was the same, filled with the scent of paint and wood, the canvases leaning quietly against the walls, but his expression was heavier, shadowed by the weight of everything unspoken. He pulled me close almost immediately, his embrace firm and desperate, as though he was afraid I might slip away if he let go. I melted into him, burying my face against his shoulder, inhaling the familiar scent of him, clinging to the only place that felt like safety. That we didn't speak much that night. Words felt inadequate, too fragile to carry the storm raging inside both of us. Instead, we let our bodies do the talking, the closeness, the trembling touches, the way our breaths mingled in the quiet. It wasn't about lust anymore, not in the way it had been in the beginning. It was about need, about anchoring ourselves against the tide that threatened to pull us apart. Every kiss tasted of both desperation and devotion, every touch carried the weight of unspoken promises. We weren't just holding each other, we were holding on for dear life. When the silence finally settled again, he whispered something against my skin that shook me more than anything else. He told me he didn't regret a single moment, that even if the world discovered us, even if it all ended badly, he would never wish it undone. My chest tightened, tears stinging my eyes, and I realized then how deep I had fallen, how entwined our lives had become. It wasn't just a secret affair anymore. It was love, raw, dangerous, and undeniable. As I walked home later, the night air felt colder, the streets darker, the weight of our reality pressing harder against my chest. But beneath the fear, beneath the uncertainty of what lay ahead, there was also a fierce, unshakable determination. I knew the risks, I knew the whispers were growing, but I also knew I couldn't let go of him. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it, because being without him no longer felt like living at all. The night before everything changed, I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of life outside my window. My chest felt heavy, not only with fear but with a strange sense of clarity. Every memory of him rushed through me at once. The first time he asked me to the studio, the way his hands had trembled slightly when he touched me, the nights filled with whispered truths and stolen kisses. It wasn't just a story anymore, it was my life, and it was entwined with his in ways I couldn't undo even if I wanted to. The thought of losing him was unbearable, but so was the thought of watching him crumble under the weight of suspicion and whispers. The world outside didn't know the depth of what we shared, but I did, and that was enough to keep me moving forward, no matter what it cost. When I saw him the next day, there was a quiet determination in his eyes, something steady but sad. He taught as though nothing was different, his voice even and calm, his hands moving across the board with the same practiced ease, but I could see the storm behind his expression. He caught my gaze once, just for a moment, and in that glance I felt it, the understanding that the time for pretending was ending. My chest clenched with both dread and certainty. Whatever came, we would face it together. That thought was both terrifying and strangely freeing. After class, when the others left and the door clicked shut, he didn't waste time with small talk or hesitation. He simply told me to come by one last time that evening. His voice was soft, but the finality in it was unmistakable. My stomach dropped, but I nodded, my heart pounding against my ribs. The hours between then and nightfall stretched painfully slow, every tick of the clock echoing louder than the last. By the time I reached his studio, my hands were trembling, and I wasn't sure if it was fear, longing, or both. The studio was quiet, dimly lit, the canvases around us like silent witnesses to the truth we were about to face. He closed the door gently, then turned to me, his face etched with both love and sorrow. Without a word, he pulled me into his arms, and I clung to him as though I could anchor myself to the moment, refusing to let it slip away. His lips found mine quickly, desperately, and the kiss carried every emotion we had left unsaid, passion, fear, devotion, and the weight of knowing time was running out, that we held each other for what felt like eternity. And when we finally pulled apart, his voice was rough when he spoke. He told me he couldn't promise forever, not in a world that would tear us apart if it knew. But he promised me something deeper. He promised that what we had was real, that it had changed him, that I had given him something he didn't think he could ever feel again. His words struck me harder than anything else, leaving me breathless, my throat tight with tears I tried to hold back. I told him the same, that I didn't need forever, that even if the world ended tomorrow, I would never regret a single second of what we had, that we stayed close long into the night, talking in whispers, our voices breaking sometimes, our hands never letting go. We spoke of dreams, of what life might look like if the world were kinder, if love didn't have to be hidden in shadows. For the first time, we let ourselves imagine freely. Trips to places where no one knew us, mornings without fear, a life built not on secrecy but on truth. It hurt to dream, knowing how far those possibilities were from reach, but it also gave us strength, reminding us of what we were really fighting for. When dawn began to creep through the curtains, painting the room in pale light, we knew our time was ending. He walked me to the door, his hand still holding mine until the very last second, reluctant to let go. I stepped out into the cool morning air, my chest aching, my body heavy with exhaustion and love all at once. The streets were quiet, the world still half asleep, and for a moment it felt like I was the only one carrying this enormous secret, this love that burned too brightly to stay hidden forever. As I walked home, I realized something had shifted inside me. The fear was still there, yes, but it no longer controlled me. What we had wasn't just a fragile secret anymore, it was a truth that had shaped me, defined me, and no one could take that away. Whether the world ever knew or not, I would carry him with me, every glance, every touch, every word. He had shown me what it meant to feel alive, to be seen, to be loved in the deepest sense. And even if our story never found a place in the light, it had already changed everything. That morning, with the city waking around me and the sun breaking through the clouds, I whispered to myself the promise I couldn't say out loud, that no matter where life carried us, I would never forget him, never deny what we had, and never let go of the part of me he had brought to life. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, not the kind the world would ever write for us, but it was ours, and that made it more real than anything else I had ever known.